Hello, welcome everybody. It is now 4 o'clock in London, 11 o'clock in New York. Delighted that you are here to join us. This is a discussion around the role that gold mining can play in contributing towards the Sustainable Development Goals. I'm Terry Heyman, I'm the CFO with the World Gold Council. And for the next hour, we're going to have an engaging discussion around the role that gold mining can play in actually sustaining and supporting social and economic development in those communities and countries where gold operations are found. I'm delighted to be joined today by three experts in the field and three people that come and bring slightly different perspectives around the role that mining can play and gold mining in particular. So first, let me introduce Lisa Sachs. Lisa is an adjunct professor at Columbia University, where she is the director of the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment. She joined there in 2008. And became director in 2012, and really has done a lot of work looking at the role of extractives and extractive industries in terms of the opportunity for sustainability and sustainable development. She teaches a master's seminar at Columbia School of International and Public Affairs, as well as at the Columbia Law School, and is a member of the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network thematic group on good governance of extractive and land resources, and was the vice chair of the World Economic Forum's Global Agenda Council on the future of mining and metals. So has a lot of experience in that intersection around sustainable development and mining, and view from one step removed outside the industry itself. Annie Markova is a director at New Gold. Is a director at Golden Star Mining Resources, a mid-tier gold mining company focused in Ghana. Annie brings over 20 years of capital markets involvement with a predominant focus on qualitative and quantitative financial analysis, and is an award-winning portfolio manager with more than 15 years investing in the global gold mining sector. She is now the founder and CEO of Investor View Advisory, which helps to bridge the gap between investors' expectations and corporate strategies, and crucially, disclosure. And a lot of that is related to designing and reporting on ESG frameworks. And as well as her board position at Golden Star, she's also the chair of the Safety, Environmental and Social Sustainability Committee, and a member of the Nominating and Governing Committee at Silvercrest Metals. So Annie, welcome. And then we have, from an executive perspective and somebody working day to day on these matters within a gold mining company, Claire Lana. Claire's a director of sustainability and external relations at Newmont, the world's largest gold mining company, and has extensive experience, again, in this area around sustainability, with prior experience as a consultant and with the International Council of Mining and Metals. So thank you very much to my panelists for joining us, and really looking forward to the discussion today. And part of the reason for holding this discussion today obviously is linked to the UN agenda and the work on the SDGs and a decade for action. And here we are, September 2020, and the SDG target around 2030. One of the areas of research that the gold industry has put forward has been, what actually is the gold mining industry doing to contribute to the SDGs? And so today, the World Gold Council, which is a membership association representing the world's leading gold mining companies, has put out a new report asking that question: how has the gold mining industry contributed to the SDGs? This report is available at gold.org, and encourage everybody to take a look. And in this report, we profile what our member companies are doing to contribute to sustained social and economic development in those communities and countries where they operate. We have case studies from around the world across almost all of the 17 SDGs, and we'll touch on that a little bit more in the conversations today. So let me start, and I'm going to start, Lisa, with you, and you very kindly contributed a foreword to this report, and the Columbia Center has done quite a lot of work around responsible mining, both with artisanal and with large-scale gold mining. I know you contributed in a report with the Responsible Mining Foundation on looking at the role of mining and the Sustainable Development Goals. So Come on, give us a starting point. Where is the gold mining industry doing well? Where are there areas for improvement?
Yeah, wonderful. Well, thank you so much both for including me in today's discussion, but also for allowing me a sneak peek at the report and an opportunity to reflect on it, which I really appreciated, given the history that you mentioned in my thinking very much at exactly this challenge of how the sector can contribute. It's no surprise, it was very heartening to see the report and to see the leading gold companies really showing attention to the SDGs, particularly given the urgency and the importance of the goals in so many of the regions in which gold mining takes place. And I think the report really valuably illustrates the progressive engagement of the sector with the SDGs over the past 5 years since their adoption. And I can speak to that too, having tried to have some of these conversations 5 years ago when the SDGs were new to the sector, and their relevance was not as clear to the sector. So the shift is absolutely notable. I think what strikes me from the report is that companies are really increasingly recognizing the global transformations within which their projects are taking place. They are increasingly looking to and understanding the development context in which the projects are taking place, the plans and priorities and the challenges of the places in which they're operating, and linking their own activities, both operationally and in terms of social and environmental investments to those local realities, and recognizing the unique influence that mining companies have on many of the goals through their resources and their technologies and their networks. So all of that is really commendable, hugely commendable. I think the report also wonderfully does not shy away from the fact that more work is needed, and I agree with that. I think the report really underscores how mining companies, including gold mining companies, are at the heart of the sustainable development challenge through the materials they produce, their operations, their supply chains, the infrastructure, their engagement with communities and with governments. It's an incredibly complex sector, which is one of the main reasons I gravitated toward it so many years ago. And while the report highlights the very positive ways that mining can contribute, it also emphasizes many of the very real impacts that require new solutions and approaches. And maybe just to mention those, because I think that's where really our conversation should continue to go in the coming years. Mining is, of course, one of the most resource-intensive sectors. Its need for land and water and energy at a time that we're experiencing real crises in each of those areas. Mining is often in remote and impoverished communities, sometimes requiring displacement of those communities or of livelihoods. The other reality, which I've talked about, Terry, with you and with some of your colleagues too, and we're all aware of, is that mining also has a legacy of historical shortfalls, both by the sector, but also by its government counterparts, that has challenged the trust of its communities, whose trust is so critical for the success of companies. So I think rebuilding that trust is paramount. And to my mind, that's going to come through demonstrated practice, not only of the positive contributions, which are important and absolutely commendable, but also on a real reckoning with and mitigation of the negative impacts. So maybe I'll stop there for the moment.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Lisa. And Annie, I wonder if you've got anything to add to that. I mean, Lisa talks about a complex industry, some of these challenges of the past. Would you agree with that characterization?
Terry, I can come in on that if that's helpful.
Please, Claire.
Yeah, and I think, Lisa, you're so right to highlight some of the challenges of the past. We've certainly learned lessons the hard way. Newmont's 100 years old. About 30 years ago, we left the US and went into Peru, Uzbekistan, and Indonesia, and really learned some of those very challenging lessons about managing environmental impacts, maintaining community support. And I think that does help shape a company's approach to environmental and social governance issues. I really liked the point you made about demonstrated practice on the ground. I think the World Gold Council's report is excellent at illustrating some of those positive contributions. But I think what's more important that we're seeing come from the World Gold Council and from ICMM is now these responsible gold mining principles and these mining principles that are pushing the disclosure of performance down to the site level. So there really now is this expectation that at the site level, companies are demonstrating their what they're doing to address negative social and environmental impacts and how they can positively contribute at that site level. And that performance expectation previously has been aggregated at the global level and may not have provided the transparency that some stakeholders want to see. So I think that's a really crucial move for demonstrating that performance. And then crucially, that has to be independently assured. So that's a great move that the industry as a whole has made.
And Claire, just to pick up on that point, the responsible gold mining principles very clearly, I think, set out what constitutes, as you say, responsible gold mining, and was developed over a 2-year process with extensive consultation. How do you, as at Newmont, the world's largest gold mining company, balance that mix of do no harm that Lisa speaks to in the forward, and then playing a role in contributing to the societies where you're operating, and how do you think about if you like, net positive impact on the SDGs?
Yeah, I think what we know from international frameworks, particularly international human rights frameworks like the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, is that we cannot offset our negative impacts by doing good elsewhere. So the baseline expectation, this do no harm, is that we need to manage those negative impacts. So when we think about Newmont's priority SDGs, and we identified those through an initial mapping exercise where we realized that there's very few of the 17 goals we can't contribute to. And I think the World Gold Council report illustrates that for the sector more broadly. There's very few goals that the sector can't contribute to. But we really wanted to be strategic about goals that we could, that were most aligned to our business strategy and that we could positively move the needle on. So we landed on 5 priority goals. But contributing to water and sanitation, good health and well-being, gender equality, decent work and economic growth, those are our priorities, we need to do that in addition to managing our negative impacts. So there needs to be that base level expectation that we're managing impacts, and then we can think about our positive contributions. So I think we can't lose sight of that with the focus on the positive aspects of the Sustainable Development Goals. We need to think about that impact piece first. I think also we obviously need to think about what contributions are appropriate in what context. So some contributions we can make at the global level, so on gender equality and women's empowerment. Obviously, there is a role for that in every single jurisdiction that we operate in. Other contributions will need to be more local. So water initiatives, for example, in Peru, where we know that 10,500 families now benefit from increased access to potable water that may not have had access before. That's obviously a very specific need in that community. Contributing to potable water and community access will be less relevant where there's strong infrastructure in place, like in Canada or like in the US. So it's recognizing where our contribution can be global and where it needs to be local, and accepting that managing negative impacts is just the starting point.
Thank you, Claire. And I hear that a lot from our members around, you need to have this very clear understanding about how you manage some of the negative impacts associated with gold mining. And indeed, I think our work on this new report on gold mining's contribution to the Sustainable Development Goals would have seemed sort of rather out of place if we hadn't put out the responsible gold mining principles that do first very clearly set out what gold mining companies should be doing. Just for everybody that's listening in, please do pose questions. There is a chat function, and I will get to those a little bit later on in the discussion. So Annie, let me turn to you and your perspectives from an investor lens. Lots of discussion already just in this conversation around environmental, social governance. Clearly that's become more important from an investor perspective, or at least Is that a temporary phenomenon? Is it a pandemic, COVID-related phenomenon, or is it a permanent part of the investor landscape going forward?
Hello, everyone, and thank you for the question. Absolutely not. This is not a temporary event. We are of the first innings of the new wave of sustainable investments now, with the UN PRI signatories representing more than $100 trillion of asset under management. Asset owners have made a commitment of integrating ESG factors into their decision-making process. And if we look at the capital going towards sustainable funds and ESG ETFs, we can witness that it is not just the large institutions, but also the individual retail investors who would like to make a positive impact towards what they believe is the right path forward for our societies. And investors are already linking the ESG performance to financial metrics and business modeling. And the emergence of impact-weighted accounting is a reality. The UN SDGs are top of mind for the new generation of investors, and they will become even more of a filter for capital allocation going forward. Investors want to see a meaningful change to the quality of life, which can only be achieved through setting corporate targets and working with governments and regulators to set new standards. Capital markets will continue to seek appropriate risk-adjusted returns, but assessment of the risks have broadened now to include climate change, human capital, supply chains, ethics, social engagements, amongst other impacts. If those impacts are meaningful, they will get reflected in the cost of capital and its availability for the mining operations. And we all know that mining is a very capital-intensive business, and we need to respect those parameters. If we do not capture, measure, manage, and communicate the relevant ESG factors, we will pay the price in terms of poor returns for our investors. In the gold world, for example, now there's two vehicles for participation by investors, either investment in the gold bullion or investments in the companies that discover and deliver the metals. I think the new generation of investors do not realize how members of the World Gold Council have practiced responsible mining for years and are committed to continue to improve on that path. And I think the net positive social impact is in excess of reclamation and environmental mitigation costs. This is the side of the story we have not properly communicated. In a way, gold companies have been leaders in establishing stakeholder capitalism, because we understand how important it is, the social license to operate, and we have illustrated we can balance the interests of all stakeholders. In our industry, we need to tell and quantify that and link it to future success. I think our commitment to aligning our activities to the SDGs provides the companies with the framework to define our purpose, culture, and long-term goals, which makes it easier for the investors to understand our journeys of delivering sustainable business models. And we are all committed to getting there. We do not operate in isolation. We operate on a global basis.
Thank you, Annie. And look, a lot there around partnerships, which we'll come on to in a moment, because it's such an important part of delivery of the SDGs, but also this concept that I think is getting wider traction around what does capitalism mean, and how do you actually deliver value over the longer term, and the need to deliver across different stakeholders in order to be able to actually deliver financial value. Lisa, I'd be interested in your perspectives on that.
Yeah, this is a big, tricky question. I absolutely agree that investors are, well, there's no doubt that this is increasingly on investors' mind, and that companies are increasingly called on by all stakeholders, including investors, to demonstrate their value and contributions. I have some questions and concerns about whether existing and traditional ESG metrics are robust enough and sufficient enough to really guide the types of transformations and changes that that would meaningfully align with the SDGs and the SDG transformation. So at the center, and I outlined this actually in the foreword to the report as well, we suggest that companies not necessarily start with the checkbox of ESG frameworks, or even taking the SDGs, SDG by SDG, which I think is incredibly valuable to recognize the broad cross-cutting impacts and their intersectionality. But to understand the company and how the company works and how the company as a company aligns with the types of transformations that are needed. So as we outline in the report, in order to add value, we would suggest that companies look at the products that they are producing. Do the products contribute to societal well-being now and in the future? In the ways that companies operate in their operations, are companies managing and understanding the impacts that they can have through their actual operations? In their value chains, in the way that companies source materials all the way through end users and how end users use the materials, and in the company's business partnerships throughout its value chain, et cetera. Are there ways throughout the value chain that companies are either dislodging some risks or missing opportunities to leverage those partnerships, those collaborations, et cetera, to create more value than what's possible with an individual company? And then lastly, and critically, I think, is the company's citizenship, as we're calling it, and looking at companies' practices with respect to lawmaking processes, tax practices, litigation practices, engagement with communities, engagement with governments. Are these constructive and aligned with the types of societal transformations that we need, that we're looking for? To me, that goes beyond compliance with the law. But it is a question of whether companies are considering the impacts of those types of practices on the SDGs and on the broader rights and interests of other stakeholders. So I think the framing is overall right, absolutely, of increasing and relevance, and that companies are going to be asked to demonstrate this value. I think my point is that I think the frameworks that we have that exist to help companies assess that value and to report on that value may not be currently sufficient. So I encourage and enjoy engaging with companies on thinking more robustly about how to meaningfully assess value creation opportunities and to demonstrate and report on them.
Right. These are lots of challenges there and lots of interesting points to pick up on, which is great. And look, I think your point around how does the product serve society is one that the gold mining industry does need to think about. And we've certainly at the World Gold Council done work looking at the role gold plays in providing financial security and financial resilience to countries and communities and individuals around the world. There's a reason why central banks hold so much gold, is to protect and look after their citizens in times of greater challenge. And the last 6 months have been a good example of that. But I think as an industry, there really is a need for everybody in that value chain to think about, why are we doing this? Why are we creating this product? As well as the impact that you can have on the ground, to pick up on Claire's point. This is what's happening on the ground, and this is how we're mitigating risk and delivering performance. But so I agree with that. I also agree on your sort of question and challenge around, and the question has come up in the comments section as well. There are so many different metrics around ESG performance and around value and around what good looks like, and yet maybe we still don't have the answer. So do we have a bit of both? There's too many and too few, and how do we think about that? Claire, maybe you can give some perspectives on that question.
Yeah, I mean, it is a challenging one. It's very difficult for companies to keep abreast of this multitude of indices and expectations for reporting and assurance and site level certification and things that we see. I think the work that the RMI and ICMM and World Gold Council and others have done around equivalency is really important. So can we assess at one time a sight on a whole range of indices or a whole range of expectations. But ultimately, the reporting has to drive performance improvements. And unless it's doing that, there's no point. So we need to think very strategically about the initiatives that we do sign up to, that really add value, that change performance on the ground, and that are meaningful to our stakeholders. So our stakeholders have strong views on the kind of performance they want to see. And we need to align to that and ultimately work towards performance improvements. But it is a big challenge because there are so many. I just wanted, Terry, just to quickly pick up on the prevalence of ESG for investor moment. This from a number of CEOs, even yesterday in the run up to America's Gold Forum, just about how generalist investors are now investing in the gold mining sector a lot more. And they really have ESG front of mind. They really want to see strong ESG performance from companies in a sustainable way. It's a key criteria for them. Maybe not always framed as ESG, but social and environmental performance has been top of mind for investors for a number of years. But we're now seeing in some of our conversations with investors, particularly European investors, they only want to talk about ESG performance. So I think this isn't going away. It's something we need to continue to measure, to report on, and to Lisa's point, challenge ourselves in terms of what does that mean for the future and what are those transformations look like. The World Benchmarking Alliance has done great work around trying to define what those social transformations and those other types of transformations are needed. There hasn't been enough work to align that with the current reporting metrics and various indices that we see. So I think that is a challenge for companies trying to navigate that space. So I provided more challenges and no answers, I'm afraid.
Sometimes that happens in these conversations. Annie, it looks like you've got some thoughts, and that could be really interesting. I know you've done a lot of work on reporting and what good reporting looks like. To Claire's challenge around, we've got to use reporting to drive performance. How do you see that for the industry at large, and now as a board member thinking about the reporting and disclosure that you oversee essentially as a board director?
I thank you for the question. I agree. Right now, there are so many standards and disclosure requirements, and the companies are struggling to pick the right ones. And I come back to the premise of we need to focus on what is material to our businesses. And we all could kind of sit back and say, well, what is going to prevent us from achieving the goals? Both financial and committal that we have made to our communities and governments and for the future of the business, because all these factors, they are business risks and they need to be properly defined and managed. I think we need as an industry to engage in trying to find the solutions, trying to simplify, but again, it has to come from a place of materiality. And now that being part of a couple of boards, I can tell you that we as well are looking for the right frameworks to link to the long-term sustainability of the business models. Obviously, there are so many factors that impact that success of a company, and the people are in the center of it. And how do we engage with our employees? How do we make sure that the health and safety is front and center all the time? I mean, we have history of working towards achieving those goals. So from a materiality point of view, we need to link those to the culture, to the way we do business. I do agree with Lisa. Those metrics should not be sitting in a silo. They need to be integrated into the day-to-day business decisions, and everyone from the frontline employees to the boards need to understand, why are we measuring these things? How are we integrating? How does that link to the promises, to the meeting of societal goals? And only then, when it's part of how we do business and we link it to the financial performance of the company, then we can have a meaningful impact. At Golden Star, for example, I'm really proud of the team under the leadership of Philip Bavares, who now is part of the executive team. And we recognize that governance of the sustainability is crucial. And we need that role to be integrated into the business decision-making process. And the team has delivered phenomenal achievements over the past few years. And we go from the activities that have been instigated as part of our commitment to work with the local governments and communities to the impacts that we're delivering. We have partnerships now with multinational organizations, with local governments, and the results, the success of those programs can be measured by, for example, the number of people working within core businesses and programs initiated by the company outside our mining. So this is the ripple effect that we're looking for to continue to push forward, to have a meaningful impact. Because let's face it, we are large employers, especially in very rural areas, and that comes with a lot of responsibility. We're going there with long-term investments, so committing capital. How do we are better stewards of that capital? By taking care and forecasting all these impacts, and we consider the efforts that the teams are taking today as an investments today for compounded positive returns for tomorrow. So only then we can be successful meeting all goals.
And Annie, do you think that your investors, the expectations of your investors of what good looks like from an ESG perspective are the same as management and the board have in terms of the positive impact you are able to have, take Golden Star on the ground in Ghana? Is there alignment between what good looks like and what should be expected of a mining company to be able to deliver?
Absolutely. I think those goals are very much in alignment, because let's face it, if we have an environmental disaster, our stock price will collapse, and we certainly will be held accountable for why have not we managed those risks. If we do not engage our communities and our workforce properly, we're not front and center with the safety practices, and we observe the human rights of everyone, well, our cost of capital will get impacted. Certainly the valuations of our company, those risks will get factored in. And so investors will not be able to earn those returns that they're expecting from their investments in the company. And also that speaks to the long-term build of an organization that is a high-performing organization when you are managing all these risks and you have the proper governance structures to guide it for success in the future. So yes, I think that long-term capital investors and organizations and boards are very much in an alignment here.
Good. Well, that's very positive to hear. But we talk quite a lot about investors and the role of investors. Let's broaden that out a little bit and think about partnerships beyond just the investors and the mining companies. And obviously, we put forward in the report the view around the need for effective partnerships with communities, with governments, linking into SG 17. And actually for the gold mining sector, this is really the forefront of being able to deliver effective long-term value. Lisa, can I ask you, where do you think the gold mining sector is doing well in terms of developing partnership? And again, where is there more work to do? Who else should this sector be looking to form partnerships with? Who should be engaged but isn't currently? And how do we think about advancing SG 17 in regards to the gold mining sector?
Yeah, it's my favorite SDG for so many reasons. So it's a great question. I will get there, but just want to pick up on one thing that Ani said about just to be mindful in this discussion about ESG and risk. One thing that strikes me and that I just think it's important to bear in mind, which is relevant to this question of partnerships too, is that risk from a company's perspective and an investor's perspective is related to but different from an impact analysis. And right now, the tools that investors use, and even some interpretations of fiduciary duties, although questionable, limit to risks to the company and to the investor, which is a different framing from really understanding impacts on a community, on the SDG transformations, et cetera. So I would just encourage that we maintain that distinction, because really, contributing value and perhaps managing long-term risks, but more generally being a partner in the SDGs requires a focus on impact, even beyond or even where the risk might not be material to the company or the investors, or even if there's not that close relationship. So to that point, we think very, very much about the local. I think the most important partnership, two of the most important partnerships, I would say, are the partnerships with the local stakeholders, local government, local citizens, and even the national government. And the second, I would say, is with industry, where, Terry, you play an important role. So let me just say one thing about each of them. One thing that is evident in the report, but I think is worth underscoring because there's more that can be done, is how useful the SDGs can be to support collaboration and coherence of company activities with national and local strategic visions and priorities and plans, and to support coordination among the companies, the local government, the national government, and other local players. And that coordination can be decisive in maximizing the benefit and the opportunities and the contribution of the sector locally. Having data, understanding where the challenges are with respect to the SDGs is critical for both local planning and for companies to understand where they're having impact and where there are opportunities for contribution. Right now, data collection is not great in a lot of these places. So I think that there's an opportunity for companies to work with local or national data agencies, statistics units, with the local government to better track and understand and analyze the SDGs, the SDG indicators at the local level, and to support planning around that data. What is the role for public investments in that area? What is the appropriate role for private investment? What are opportunities to work in partnerships, some of which are laid out in the report, but I think many more can be done to bring coherence among the different approaches to addressing local level challenges and opportunities. And the second that I briefly mentioned is partnerships within the industry and with the industry's business, other business relationships and other stakeholders within their value chain. The reason I emphasize that is because value chains are complex, but they present more opportunities for the companies to think about technological advances, technological opportunities, large-scale impacts that can be had when companies work with their partners and work throughout their value chains. I think the World Gold Council provides a fantastic platform for being able to do that, and that's the other one that I would emphasize. Working with the companies and their business operations to really evaluate opportunities to leverage their collective resources to think beyond what current technological capacities are.
Look, Lisa, thank you for that endorsement of some of the work that we do, and it's been really gratifying seeing what we are able to help bring the industry together to produce, and actually, in particular, help share learning. And one of the things that I found most pleasing in putting out this new report is member companies sort of mentioning to me, oh, that's really interesting. We're learning things from actually what our peers are doing and seeing other examples of how companies are contributing and thinking about what we can do. And I agree with you, that's an excellent opportunity. Claire, I wonder if I can come to you, and I guess the way that Lisa's framed that around these two sort of core ideas around partnerships on local stakeholders and partnerships with the industry. And actually it links to one of the questions we've received around what coalitions forums are available for mining companies to join and collaborate to learn from one another and around the SDGs. So it'd be great to get your perspectives on those two dimensions, if you like, around partnerships.
Yes, yes, Terry, I'll come on to that. I just wanted to pick up on one thing that Lisa said about sometimes this disconnect between risk and community impact. So typically when we're as a company doing our risk assessments, we really are thinking about risk to the business. And one way that helped us expand that a lot more to thinking about potential community impact was by adopting the UN Guiding Principles reporting framework, which gets us to think about our salient human rights issues. So what are those human rights issues that we could negatively impact the most? There's a more articulate way of describing saliency, but it's essentially what could our negative impacts be on what human rights, and how do we marry mitigating those impacts with the sort of material business risks that we see to us as a business. And that framework has been incredibly helpful for us thinking about impacts beyond company risks and company impacts. So I just wanted to flag that one. Terry, to your point on coalitions or partnerships, and I suppose I'd expand that to multi-stakeholder groups that are working on an issue. I think there are various components of that depending on the issue. One that we have found really valuable in the responsible sourcing space is the Responsible Minerals Initiative and their mining engagement team. And that really connects us with downstream users. So that's that sort of value chain piece, Lisa, that you mentioned. How do we, as a complex and long value chain, connect with downstream or end users of our product? How do we bring them on board with an understanding of the risks that we face as an upstream company, and how we're managing those risks? And what does that look like all the way through to refinery and smelter? What are some of those ESG performance standards that need to be in place along the value chain? And those conversations have been really valuable to us. I think you're right about the local level partnerships. And again, I think they're most effective when they are convened around a particular issue. So we're working in Australia, for example, through different councils councils about thinking about watershed in general. So watershed risks and opportunities. So not just the water risks we pose as a company, but who are those other users of a water source in a broader watershed? Who's the local government there? What are the local water councils? Who are the NGOs working on the issues? What other companies are in the area? And how do we form partnerships or multi-stakeholder groups to address those risks and opportunities? On the SDGs in general, we're not members of a broader group just working on SDGs. And I do think you can be more effective focusing those efforts locally, using other actors. So that's all I'll say on that one. Thanks, Terry.
And I think you're talking about the connectivity across the supply chain and understanding impacts beyond your own operations. I think the mining sector is getting increasingly mindful of the need to do that. In a somewhat similar spirit, and sticking with you, Claire, one area that really is an important area for the gold sector relates to upstream, relates to artisanal and small-scale mining. And I know that that's an area that you spend a decent amount of your time looking at and thinking about from a Newmont perspective. Clearly, there are, unfortunately, some poor practices associated with certain forms of artisanal mining. What can be done, and what are your perspectives around how to, if you like, bring in the artisanal and small-scale miners into the conversations around the SDG and to find opportunities to deliver better outcomes aligned with the SDGs for those communities?
Yeah, it's a good question and a very complex issue. I think, Terry, you flagged some of the risks that we know are associated with ASM, some of the health and safety, environmental, social risks. But increasingly in recent years, there has been a recognition that artisanal and small-scale mining is vital for millions of livelihoods around the world. And supporting legitimate ASM can be an incredibly powerful way of lifting a huge number of the population out of poverty. This is something we've tried to recognize in our global ASM strategy. So we do have a security pillar because there are a range of security risks and issues associated with ASM. But then crucially, we have a livelihood pillar of that strategy as well. So recognizing that livelihood piece and trying to understand how we can support legitimate ASM livelihoods. And then there's also a pillar of that strategy around engagement. So how do we engage with others on this very complex issue? I think, unfortunately, there's no sort of universal silver bullet on this or a universally right way to handle ASM. In some countries, it poses more of a security risk than in others. In Suriname, ASM has been present for generations. It's a very, very important livelihood there. So in that context, we've thought about how we support ASM to form cooperatives and how we engage with those cooperatives to identify common development outcomes for that group. That's involved having to work really closely with the government, who didn't want to initially encourage any kind of ASM, but we have brought them on board with our approach of forming co-ops and working with that group. In other areas where it has posed more of a security risk, like Ghana, we've worked closely with a security approach, but they now are very interested in a community mining initiative. So again, thinking about how they can support legitimate ASM livelihoods. I think in those various contexts, there are different ways that some of the SDGs can be contributed towards. So for example, on good health and well-being, if we were able to get to some sort of coexistence model where ASM may be tolerated in and around our operations, can we support capacity building around health and safety? Can we support good health and well-being type initiatives? So contributing to that goal. And then obviously SDG 8 around decent work and economic growth, just by supporting those livelihoods and the multiplier and the ripple effect and the induced employment that would come from supporting those livelihoods would be a big contribution to SDG 8. But again, it's going to be very context specific. And first and foremost, we need to be managing those social, environmental, health and safety and security risks in any program that we're supporting.
Almost goes back to where we started about managing the risks and how to, for an ASM sector that does have those challenges you talk about, Claire, recognizing that the challenge just around governance and around getting the right conditions in place to mitigate some of those risks and then be able to deliver because of the huge potential there is in the number of people that, depend on their livelihood on ASM. Lisa, Annie, any perspectives on ASM?
Certainly, this is something that we need to be aware of. As Claire said, we're talking about the livelihoods of a lot of poor people. I think that what we can do is provide alternative employment. For example, at Golden Star, we are converting our tailings into palm oil plantations, and we're training the local communities how to be farmers. Also, we're training how to raise animals and be part of the food supply chain for remote communities. I think those initiatives go way beyond the first positive impact. It has a maybe second derivative of reduction of deforestation and water pollution. So considering what the challenges are and trying to find alternatives, I think this is what I think we need to focus on.
And those examples of Golden Star and actually taking a tailings facility and making employment out of it is a great example and actually a source, I hope, of learning for the sector as a whole. And look, I think one of the things that we're all thinking about is the pandemic and how that's going to impact the world. And ASM is going to be has the potential to be particularly impacted. Lisa, maybe just in the broad, there's been a lot of discussion over the last day and a half around COVID and the impact that's going to have on the SDGs, looking specifically at the gold mining sector, large scale and artisanal small scale. What are your thoughts on how we don't get, if you like, too much of an interruption in some of this progress by the pandemic, and how do we collectively continue to move forward at the pace that's needed to meet the 2030 target?
Yeah, it's a great question. Of course, one that's always on our minds. To my mind, and many of my colleagues with whom we discuss it, COVID is both another disaster and also a symptom of the underlying problems. And it has really exposed the weaknesses of our societies and of our political systems. I think it's useful to understand COVID in the context of several major environmental crises that we're facing, all of which are relevant for all sectors, but of course, for the reasons that we've discussed, for the mining sector in particular as well. Pandemic diseases are coming more and more frequently. This one is particularly devastating, but it's not actually unique in how quickly we're seeing new pandemics crop up around the world. And it's not surprising from what we understand from our colleagues at Columbia, because pandemics are secondary to land use changes and to climate change, which are two other extraordinary environmental crises that we're facing. The other environmental crisis we could add to that is one of pollution, of air, water, et cetera. So these environmental challenges are pervasive. We've now come to understand the enormous impacts of the intersection of these environmental challenges with our societal inequalities, with poverty, and so on. These are all identifiable challenges, and they are precisely the ones that the Sustainable Development Goals, the Paris Climate Agreement, and a range of other international environmental agreements have been adopted to address. And yet we're seeing that they're not strong enough, and politics has been overwhelmingly poor. And in the face of a political deficit, to put it nicely, particularly in this country, it's really important for companies to step up, or at least not to get mired in the political failings. I would put it that way. In local communities, there's no doubt that COVID is presenting an immediate crisis for which resources and immediate response is necessary. And I've seen how mining companies are responding at the local level, and that's obviously commendable and important and really valuable. I think at a slightly broader level, and to your question about how to ensure we don't lose momentum, I think one trend that we're seeing, not of the leading companies by any means, but a really important one, is companies that are leveraging the political vacuum to push for regulatory rollbacks, which of course we're seeing around the world, to push for other political processes, which our systems are vulnerable to, our political systems are vulnerable to these types of pressures, which is indeed a dangerous distraction from the type of political commitments and attention we need to actually solving the problems. So to my mind, the most important thing is for companies to understand these interconnected realities, to understand the environmental crises that we're facing and how they're intertwined with these crises of poverty and inequality and health, and to avoid the pressures to be opportunistic and short-term, and particularly to avoid the short-term political whims, which are so disconnected from the type of leadership and long-term trends that we need, and rather to maintain focus on the long-term transformations, the view of progressive societal transformation that we've been talking about. And I think if leading companies, given particularly in the mining sector, the range of stakeholders that you work with, can stay focused on those longer-term trends, that's precisely the leadership we need to not lose momentum and to emerge more quickly and positively from this crisis.
Claire, I'd be interested in your thoughts on that as a company that's been at the forefront and being one of those contributors. I think Newmont has contributed 20 million in direct aid to support communities through some of these COVID challenges. We've got some questions around the impact on suppliers, mining companies. Maybe just want to talk about how you see both the short-term and the longer-term learnings from COVID.
Yeah, so I think the first thing to say is there's definitely opportunity to link short-term COVID responses to longer-term development work. And actually the ICMM, Business Fights Poverty and Partnering Initiative, has put out a Building Forward Better framework, which really speaks to this point. So how do we link these responses to longer term efforts to build and strengthen community resilience? So I'd encourage all of you to look at that. one way that we're thinking about this is the three sort of strategic areas that we're focusing on from our COVID Global Community Support Fund. So one of them is around economic resilience. And I think this speaks to the point I've just seen in the chat about supporting SMEs. So it was really important for us, as well as thinking about short-term support that we can provide for health initiatives or health programs or PPE or supporting hospitals and things like that. Food security was another sort of immediate need that we've seen, but we did really want this longer term economic resilience piece to be embedded in our distribution of funds from the Community Support Fund. And that really allows us to support some of these SMEs, to support suppliers, to support critical business partners of ours, to shorten their time to recovery, to create the conditions for growth, and generally just to have sort of more of a longer term impact with some of those funds. I will say that so immediate needs that we need to meet, I do think some of the broader expectations for gold mining companies will remain the same throughout our COVID response and beyond. We don't know what the post-COVID-19 world looks like yet, but there will still be expectations that we contribute to sustainable local economic development. And Annie, you mentioned some of the work that you've been doing to create jobs beyond the sector, and I think that's crucial. If we're really contributing and acting as a catalyst for longer term economic development, we have to be creating jobs beyond the sector. We have to be measuring and reporting on induced employment. And we do that through a series of economic impact reports in the countries where we operate. And we know that our contribution to that induced employment or that broader contribution to the economy, it can be between 5 and 30 jobs, 5 or 30 jobs created or induced employment, depending on where we operate. So I think that role as acting as a catalyst is incredibly important. And then we'll obviously expect to see health at the forefront of any discussions on development going forward. So as the baseline expectation, how do we support healthy, not just workforces, but communities and broader societies? And until we do that, it's difficult to have conversations on development more broadly.
And Claire, you bring up health, and we've touched a little bit on COVID. We haven't actually really talked about health. We haven't talked about education so much. We haven't talked about gender and the opportunities. There's so much more that we could be talking about and should be talking about. And already we are coming towards the end of our time. So just a shout out to that Building Back Better report that you referenced. If you haven't seen it, it is excellent and well worth the read. And also to remind everybody that the new report from the World Gold Council, the gold mining industry's contribution to the SDGs, is available on our website at www.gold.org. Just before we finish, any final comments from the panelists? Annie, let me go to you. Final thoughts as you reflect on this conversation and the way forward.
Thank you for the opportunity. Let's not forget to talk about the diversity and empowering women within our organizations. We have a long journey ahead of us. We need to put the right governance structures, the proper hiring, equal pay, responsibility, to the right infrastructure, flexibility to empower our women in their organizations and to teach them leadership skills, because with 50% of the global population being represented by females, there are a lot of talented women out there. And it is our responsibility to find them, educate them, so they can be helping us create those resilient cultures that are crucial for the success of our organizations.
Absolutely, and it's been great to see that there's been some progress, but a lot more to go. Lisa, any final thoughts?
Yeah, just to add one thing on that, which is that the mining sector is really a technology sector at its core, and technology is going to be absolutely critical for especially developing countries to achieve all of the SDGs. So in addition to emphasizing gender equality and education for girls, I would also emphasize the opportunities to strengthen training in technological skills, engineering, which is really the heart of the mining sector and the heart of development. And so maybe I'll let that be my final thought, which is that what drove me to the sector in the first place 15 years ago is the transformative potential of this sector because of its tremendous reach and impacts and resources. And so I continue to believe so much in the potential of this sector. And while I would say it's a long road ahead, I actually think that the gains have been tremendous in short periods of time. And I really look forward to working with all of you and your partners on a quick and full recovery and building back better from this crisis.
Thank you, Lisa, and agree. And some of the things happening in the technology space are really interesting and have very significant opportunity for so many developing countries as well as developed. So Claire, I guess you get the final word and just quickly, and then I'm afraid we're going to have to call this panel to a close.
Just that there's a lot to do in a decade to realize the goals, but maybe just very quickly to piggyback on Annie's point, we know the importance of gender equality and women's empowerment. Without it, we can't achieve any of the goals. We hit an important milestone 2 weeks ago by appointing another female to our board, and we've now reached gender parity with 5 men and 5 women on our board. I think that setting the tone from the top is incredibly important, as well as focusing on SDG 5 as a key for us. But I've really enjoyed this conversation today. Thank you, everyone.
Well, look, that just leaves me to say thank you to the panelists, Lisa Sachs, Annie Markova, and Claire Lana. Thank you for joining us today. Everybody who participated, sorry we couldn't get through all the questions, but I have tried to weave those into the conversation. And yeah, have a good day, everybody. Thank you and bye-bye.